Hello, in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about abolition and the worker strike movement. We've been talking about this for a little bit now, but I definitely think that we're still a little bit far from finishing how this conversation really shakes out on various forms of like argumentation on the worker strike resolution. And I definitely think it's something that I probably am going to do from like all angles. So it's probably going to be one of the longer series that I do on the worker strike resolution, because I think that it's really interesting and just a really dope angle to kind of look at in terms of like all the ways it affects different affirmatives that people can read. And I definitely think it's something that works against like every single type of argument that people could read this year. And I also think that it's a really good affirmative argument, which is where I really want this video to be. I definitely think that this is your first time hearing about abolition and the worker strike. The only video that I think you really need in order to tune into this particular lecture is the one that's just the intro to the abolition and worker strike movement, because I start to kind of lay out what I think are some of the central frameworks to consider what this argument could look like on the affirmative and on the negative, and why I think it's just so important on this resolution. So I definitely think that it's good context for a lot of the conversations that we'll have in this video, where we start talking about like what abolition would look like as a critical affirmative, and the way that it kind of like has its own strengths and weaknesses, and how it best kind of answers arguments that are normally read on K's framework and T against most affirmatives that are kind of like in this vein. I definitely think it's a really creative route to go, in a place where I definitely would explore, because I think that it pushes like a central kind of like hole that's in the resolution, and that is something that's really interestingly historically based. And so I definitely think that this is a really interesting place for us to start this conversation. When I'm just generally thinking about like what is the most ideal version of this thing on the affirmative, I definitely think that the first thing is a really strong historical explanation of like how what the relationship is between what has been legally historically defined as worker, and like how that has been defined in distinction to prisons, or in distinction to workers. I think that, for instance, there's a lot of history to talk about how things like the Fair Labor Act, etc., don't include prisoners under the kind of like terms and conditions for like what is defined under the Fair Labor Act. And I definitely think there are a lot of other interesting kind of like laws and histories that to bring into play about like how prisoners have been like have been explicitly denied the kind of like title of worker through various types of laws that have defined them outside of like the employee kind of like employer relationship, how things like the prison system kind of like change the dynamic, and so that they're not really thought of under the same kind of like conditions or standards, and why that kind of creates basically the foundation for the continuation of capitalism under a different name, and makes like the resolution kind of look like this smokescreen in order to like basically continue carcerality at its like most violent. And I definitely think that this is a really interesting place to start the debate, because I feel like it's one in which a lot of the like what people would normally read of, for instance, as topical versions of the app, and what people will kind of read of as like legal remedy strategies, really don't make sense against this particular type of affirmative, because of the way in which it's talking about a specific vacuum that's already written into the law for how the U.S. is able to define the worker. And all of the arguments that people would make about like how this thing could be done topically would be extra topical and link back to a lot of the offense that people would be kind of like reading anyways. And so I think it's a really good place for you to kind of like start off at like a T angle. But I also think against a lot of other arguments, like methodologically, you have a lot of arguments to expand on in terms of like what it actually looks like to do abolition in the context of the worker strike movement, and why an explicit refusal of the state is so important in terms of abolition. I feel like the best arguments to be made are about why the kind of like frame of legality, because of the way in which it continues like subjects workers to something that's labeled as outside of human and outside as worker, necessitates like illegal acts of sabotage, acts of fugitivity, etc., and really push the burden of like what abolition can look like, not only as a theoretical force, but the way it is able to materially kind of like lean into what people will usually read things like crackdown, etc., other types of arguments against. Because I think when we're talking about like the case debate, for example, a lot of the best arguments that you can make is that the vision of things like crackdown are just not historically accurate to the ways in which people like Asada, the Soledad brothers, the Black Liberation Army, etc., the movement have already kind of been dealing with this type of crackdown of violence for years. But there's still a continuation of the way in which they're able to fight and create fugitive modes of abolition through other people, through various types of tactics that follow in their name, etc. And I think that being able to push a lot of why that is able to overcome some of the crackdown barriers that people would normally read, and winning that the kind of like usage of crackdown as the continued pathologization that is like framed in order to make the topic coherent in the first place, is a really good place for you to situate a lot of offense and make it so that a lot of the arguments that people would normally make against you really don't make that much sense. Additionally, I think that a lot of the other arguments that people will read on case are about like why the kind of like the limitation to things like the resolution mean that we're not able to think about the way in which, like, for instance, the recognition of state and workers' rights are really key to, like, you know, things like democratic modeling and things like that. And I think that being able, those are kind of things that will turn into, like, for instance, like disads, but also reasons about why things like liberalism are repairable and like necessary. And I think that a lot of your arguments can prove why, like, liberalism at a foundation like requires carcerality and the continued kind of like violence that that makes carcerality kind of like complex and like basically foundational to the continuation of the US as like a capitalist system, because of the way in which it is able to use things like the worker strike to hide behind the ways in which it exploits people in other places in order to make back the costs that it's kind of like losing by giving into workers, etc. I then think when you transition this into like things like what a framework of tea debate look like, you have a lot of pieces to really indict a lot of the core central tenets about why things like framework of tea operate as the same kind of like punitive conditioning measures that attempt to make people like behave in a certain way in order to like garner the forms of recognition that they think are valuable or that are good and sustainable. And I feel like a lot of the arguments that people make about like debate and the sustainability of debate through things like topicality and framework and the adherence to the resolution are the same types of management that people use in order to like make arguments about why state recognition and the worker strike are so important, and why those kind of like the sustainability that's created by like the framing of like the usage of the worker strike and its recognition by the state is just net better than being able to like create resistance on the outside because of the lack of backlash, because of its palpability and ability to be responded to by the state. And I think that that's a really interesting place for you to kind of like start a lot of offense in terms of like why those kinds of like hand-in-hand measures are what could and continue carcerality as like a project that informs all of our kind of epistemological bias. And I think there are a lot of arguments that you make about why things like abolition democracy, or just understanding why abolition and the academy have such intimate ties to each other, make it even more important to forward these conversations in debate and have them as central parts of how we're thinking about the constitution of various forms of violence and how we respond to forms of violence that the state kind of participates in and of itself, without trying to allowing the state to like make itself this kind of like passive actor that's able to legitimize whatever resistance doesn't actually challenge the way in which it kind of like recirculates and recreates various forms of hegemony. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into videos I'll be doing talking about abolition and worker strike. I'm really enjoying it, and I definitely think that these affirmative videos could be a really interesting avenue for you to explore on the topic, especially if you're a critical team. And so yeah, as always, thank you, and hopefully you keep tuning in.